Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to host you all here in our Wednesday typical afternoon event. We are at Sciences Po. We are at PSIA, the Paris School of International Affairs, with our 1,400 students. We are very happy to be here today to host an event that is related, of course, to the celebrations that we just had of the International Women's Day. And today we are very happy to host three high distinguished speakers who are with us to help us to understand better what is happening around the world, and first of all, in three important countries like France, Sweden, and the US. So a comparison between Europe and the American system on the topic of feminist foreign policy. I'm very glad to present the speakers. First of all, I'm very glad to have at the table here in Salle Gauguel, because we try to have some physical presence in Sciences Po building. Thank you very much, Delphine O, for being with us. It's a great pleasure. Delphine O is, first of all, teacher at Sciences Po and teacher up at PSIA. That is for us the most important presentation. French ambassador at large, frontline with the Next Generation Equality Forum in June in Paris as Secretary General. And I'm very also glad to announce that immediately at the end of our event at 7 o'clock, we will have another event organized by the Junior Diplomat Initiative, students event. And I'm very glad to say that if you wish, you can continue at 7 o'clock Paris time with this other event where Delphine O will be present. Thank you very much, Delphine.
Thank you.
And thank you for your commitment among our scholars in our faculty, where we are trying to expand the gender-related academic offer at PSIA. Very glad to welcome once again Margot Wallström. Margot Wallström is former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden and former Vice President of the European Commission. So both an experience in your country, Sweden, and an experience at European level. And you were with us some years ago in another great event. We have a fantastic souvenir of your presence. So thank you very much for being with us, connected from Sweden. And I'm very pleased to introduce Melanne Verveer, who served as ambassador at large for global women's issues under Hillary Clinton at the State Department during the Obama administration, and who is now the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. Georgetown is one of the universities with which we have a twin partnership. I'm very glad to have you here, both because of your experience and also because of Georgetown University. Thank you very much for being with us, connected from Washington, D.C. Today's event will be organized as usual with some introductory remarks by our three guest speakers. Then, at the end of these introductory remarks, we will open the Q&A session. I'll ask you to, all the students connected to use the chat and to send us your questions, and I will try to use the different questions and to spread the questions among our guest speakers. I stop immediately. I thank you all, and I give immediately the floor in Sweden to Margot Wallström. Margot, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Il faut dire quelques mots en français. Bonjour à vous tous. Et aussi, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. Et c'est vraiment pour moi un grand plaisir et honneur aussi d'être là avec mes collègues et amis, Melanne et Delphine O. Mais les vrais VIP, c'est vous, les étudiants. And I very much look forward to continuing now in English, but also to be able to talk to you and with you, and I hope for many questions as well. I think we need to start where we are right now, in the midst of a pandemic. And this is, of course, in every way a historically unique, global, common experience, but also an experience that has displayed, I would say, brutally, the kind of lack of equality and discrimination in the world and at home, between rich and poor countries, between men and women. And we've seen that COVID-19 affects women and men differently. More women are in precarious jobs. More women are on the front line of this crisis as carers and nurses, etc. As we know, women have lower wages and lack access to financing. And women are also subjects of violence. And we've seen a horrible and totally unacceptable increase of the number of cases of violence against women and children in so many countries around the world. And this happens at the same time as we know that when women in poor countries, they invest twice as much as men in the local society, in the local community and their own family. We know that when women have more of an influence in a society, they make decisions that are a benefit to the whole, that benefit the whole family. Children get better food, the families use more money to healthcare and also education. More girls have an opportunity to go to school, and the vicious cycle of poverty is broken. Feminist foreign policy is not just a motto, and that has never been the intention, that it will just be something nice to present as a concept, but really about concrete and practical policies to improve the possibilities for also poor women around the world. And I think that democratic and more equal, gender equal societies are the best medicine against extremism, war, and poverty. Now, I will just give you 5 arguments why a feminist foreign policy is the right way forward. First, I think it is the right thing to do, of course. Women make up half of the population of the world. What defense can there be that we should not have the same opportunity as men to live as we want? Feminism belongs in foreign policy because women's participation leads to more sustainable peace. That is the experience we've made, and we know that more women means more peace. Secondly, it is needed. It is badly needed. Look out over the world. In several countries, women still may not open bank accounts, not own land, not take whichever job they want. Women are grossly underrepresented in parliaments, governments, and on company boards. And millions of girls are still victims of genital mutilation, forced marriage, and sexual violence. The third argument is, it is simple. It is not complex, as we often hear. It does not have to be difficult to make the world more gender equal. Give girls the same opportunities for education. Let women participate and have a say. Recognize that women's rights are human rights. And fourthly, it works. Our feminist foreign policy affects the lives of millions of women. We provide support for contraception, midwives, and safe abortions. We ensure that more women are involved in peace processes. We train female parliamentarians. We stimulate debate about the role of fathers in countries that have then introduced paternity leave. And if those four reasons are not sufficiently convincing, then the fifth reason is that a feminist foreign policy makes life better for everyone. Research shows that gender equal societies have better economic development, better health, and greater well-being. Gender equality is therefore not a women's issue. It is an issue for everyone. And finally, many women leaders, as we can see, are now doing better than men. At least this is how we look at it at the moment. The leadership style, including the way they speak and act, is different. And the time has come for that. And we've seen leaders like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand or Angela Merkel or other leaders around the world. They follow their own path and their own hearts very often. And it seems to be they are able to keep confidence and trust from the people, and therefore it is also effective. So if we now want to build back better, I think that as UN Secretary General Guterres said on the 8th of March, there is clear evidence, such as better social protection programs, stronger climate policies, and enduring peace agreements when women are in governments, parliaments, or peace negotiations. So that's why I argue for a feminist foreign policy.
Thank you so much, Margot. It was so interesting, and I'm sure that you will receive a lot of questions on your 5 points to go into depth, into more details on this discussion. I'd like to give the floor now to Melanne Verveer for your introductory remarks. Melanne, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Letta. It's a pleasure to be with all of you at Sciences Po, to be with Delphine O, who has such an important portfolio for France on these issues, and the upcoming conference that UN Women and France will be united together in promoting, and to be with my dear friend Margot Wallström, who has really led the way in this space for so many. Where she started is indeed the place to start today, because in many ways, we are enveloped in COVID. It has demonstrated deep disproportional impacts on women and exposed inequalities. We have to fundamentally deal with those inequalities if we're going to bring the kind of change to our world we need to see. And at the same time, we have the climate change crisis. And some might say, well, that's not a women's issue. Well, all issues are women's issues in all respects. Climate impacts the most vulnerable, who are women, those who are in the worst socioeconomic conditions, many marginalized, many in agriculture, but they are also agents for change. And those are the twin pillars, those impacts and the fact that we have to unleash the participation of women. We have to ensure their perspectives permeate all of the issues, and we have to apply a gender lens to the public policy work that we are all working on. And in the United States, really very seriously, we undertook this charge when Secretary Clinton was our Secretary of State. I was working with her as the first US ambassador for global women's issues at the time. We didn't call it a feminist foreign policy. I'm not sure we would have gotten very far if we did, but we were all about, and the United States was all about, integrating these issues into our diplomatic work and into our development work. To this day, USAID applies a gender lens to all of the development programs. And what did that mean in terms of the work of the State Department? Well, it meant in many respects, it meant looking at all of those issues the State Department deals with. Now, why? because we know that the fate of women and the fate of nations goes hand in hand. In fact, at Georgetown, we have created over the last few years a global index on women, peace, and security, the first ever, and it, in a comprehensive way, looks at the well-being of women. The countries that are prospering, the countries that are in peace, are countries that are doing well in terms of the well-being of women, the condition of women. The countries that are mired in conflict, that are unstable, that are overrun by extremist groups, those are countries where the condition of women is at its worst. We have got to take this issue seriously if we are going to do our foreign policy work and our development work seriously. So that meant for us, it meant really integrating these issues across everything that our foreign policy apparatus is dealing with our economic work.
We don't hear now. We are trying to fix the problem. I'm sorry, Melanne, for this technical problem, but...
When did you lose me?
Do you hear us, Melanne?
I hear you loud and clear.
You hear us, but we don't hear you.
I just got a word that says that we can be heard. I can be heard to others. It may be your hookup at Sciences Po.
Unfortunately, we don't hear you. We are sorry for that. I'm trying to understand if there are possibilities to fix immediately the problem. Otherwise,
Okay.
So I think you can continue because we have only the problem here, myself and Delphine. So we trust you and what you are saying, but I think you can continue because the rest of students are able to listen to you.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I'm a little not sure where I left off, but I will try to state very briefly how this perspective, this application of a gender lens, if you will, has applied to the ongoing work of our foreign policy. So when it comes to the work that is done regionally, the work that is done on conflict and stabilization, it means that a gender lens is applied. It's applied to Afghanistan. It's applied to Yemen. It's applied to Syria. You cannot do those issues in divorce and say that you are really integrating these issues. In fact, you'll never have a durable peace without the participation of women and without their perspective, their experiences being brought to the table. In fact, so much of the peace work today is going on at the local level among local peace builders, and that is not connected to what's happening at the formal level, where frankly, so much of the time, those negotiations are frozen. So we have to factor this in. And during this time, when we undertook this, that was the time when we adopted the US National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. And today, the United States has the first law. The test for us will be to 100% implement that law in all of our governmental agencies as appropriate. In addition to that, it was during this time, after a trip to the DRC, that Secretary Clinton confronted the whole reality of sexual violence continuing in these conflict zones with impunity, and went to the United Nations. The resolution that is the progeny of 1325 was adopted on sexual violence and conflict. And in fact, dear Margot Wallström was the first special representative of the Secretary General to confront the sexual violence in conflict issue as her prime responsibilities in this new role. So that is a model of integration in peace and security. Similarly, in economics, today we have a plethora of data that underscores the fact that women can drive prosperous economies, creating jobs, their entrepreneurial activities, training, access to capital, all of the things that they need to prosper need to be supported. And it means trade. What are our trade policies doing to ensure that women can have a seat at the trade table as well and benefit from it? So we focused on the trade policies in Africa. We have a special preference for many African countries. The women weren't benefiting from it. Asking, why are not women having the same opportunities? Similarly, with an international platform like the APEC, which is the countries that border the Pacific on both sides. Again, women weren't part of those discussions. So the approach here has to be concrete actions. It's not, as Minister Wallström said, it's not slogans, it's not mottos. They're fine if they make us act, but we have to do that hard work every day of integrating these gender issues across all of our foreign policy work, and that includes our development work. And as an American here with you today, I am confident that the Biden administration is going to take this even farther because already they've announced a Gender Policy Council at the White House on the same level as the Domestic Policy Council and the Economics Council and the National Security Council. And the job of that council is integrate gender across everything we are doing. And when my successor is appointed at the State Department, that will ensure that this continuum actually evolves even more significantly, I believe, in the months ahead, because our world desperately needs it. And each of our nations needs to be completely engaged in this.
Thank you very much, Melanne. Thank you, and sorry for the technical inconvenience, but we are very happy because of your presence and because of what you just said. I now turn the floor to Delphine O. Thank you for being with us once again, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Sciences Po for offering me this incredible opportunity at my age and in my position to be sitting on the same panel as two personal heroes that are Margot and Melanne. Margot, of course, the pioneer of feminist foreign policy, Swedish feminist foreign policy. It happens so that I am teaching a class at PSIA on feminist foreign policy, and today we're going to be welcoming Margot Wallström to talk about Swedish feminist foreign policy. So it's quite auspicious. And also, of course, Melanne Verveer, who is, if you allow me to say so, Melanne, the godmother of all ambassador for women's issues that came after you. I was appointed a year and a half ago. I'm the first French ambassador for gender equality and women's rights, and I hope that many more countries will actually appoint such positions. I will not repeat what Margot and Melanne said, maybe just a preliminary observations, because this is a conversation about feminist foreign policy. There is a growing number of countries around the world that have put gender equality and women's rights at the center of their foreign policy, who are very serious in promoting gender equality in every aspect of their foreign policy and their diplomacy. We could cite, of course, the other Nordics, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland. We could cite the UK, who's doing tremendous work on preventing sexual violence in conflict. We could cite other countries also in Africa, in Asia. I'm thinking of Australia, I'm thinking of South Korea. But what makes it different from the 6 countries in the world that have adopted a feminist foreign policy, namely Sweden, 2014, Canada, 2017, France, 2018, and then Mexico, Spain, and more recently, Luxembourg. in my own experience and observation, a couple of things make it different. The first thing is, it is actually a radical step for a government to use the F word, and by F word, I mean feminist. It is a radical move. It makes it not a marginal civil society movement to claim oneself as feminist, but something that is actually being owned by a government. And when a government like the one of Sweden says, we are a feminist government and we have a feminist foreign policy, that gives a strong impulse to all feminist movements and women's movements around the world. The second thing is, once you've officially adopted a feminist diplomacy, it makes it harder to go back for successive governments and to renege on their promise. So what I see is that in Sweden, there's been other governments coming after the one in which Margot Wallström was a minister of, but none of them has decided we're going to drop the feminist foreign policy, because once you've adopted it officially and publicly, it makes it a long-lasting public policy that other governments have to uphold. The third thing, and this is what Melanne was saying, is feminist foreign policy as its core is actually integrating gender equality in all aspects of foreign policy. And it's also recognizing, and here I'm addressing the PSIA students of theories of international relations, that you're pursuing gender equality is you pursuing something that is just and right and good because women should have the same rights as men. This is an objective, a goal of social justice and equity and equality. But you pursuing a feminist diplomacy is also a country advancing its own national and international interests. And I think we too often hear that defending women's issues and gender equality contradicts or comes into conflict with national security interest, with economic interest, trade interest. And what Melanne was saying, and I think what Sweden has shown the world, is that you can pursue those two goals at the same time. You can actually advance your economic interest through free trade agreements, through your trade policy, by promoting gender equality. You can advance your environmental agenda by promoting gender equality. You can advance your national security, international security, even nuclear interests by promoting gender equality. So even if you're a hardcore realist in international relations, you can do both at the same time and promote gender equality. Now, maybe also a word about French feminist diplomacy, since I am the ambassador for gender equality at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So what is the distinction between Sweden's feminist diplomacy, Canadians, French, Mexican, Spanish, and Luxembourgian? I think time will tell. It's still very early to say a verdict. And then if you're interested, you can also attend my class on this issue. I just want to say that, so France decided to adopt a feminist foreign diplomacy in 2018, but it's not like we didn't include gender before, just like Sweden and Canada. We've had before an international strategy for gender equality for over 10 years, which really gives the guidelines to the entire work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs pertaining to gender equality. It used to be only related to development issues, access to health, education, water, and so on. And over time, it has expanded to environment, to national security, to international security, and so on. So our commitments when the president announced that France will adopt the feminist diplomacy was first and foremost to make it cross-cutting and mainstream across all aspects of our diplomacy, which is still a work in progress. But it was also, every time that France is either holding the pen in a UN resolution, chairing any kind of UN or regional or international organization, such as, for instance, now we're sitting at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Of course, we're also a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So in every instance, in every arena, in every circle, anytime we're pushing for any issue, we have to integrate the gender angle. Even if the topic is not directly related to gender, actually everything is related to gender. So if France has the presidency of the G7 like we had in 2019, we decided to continue the tradition started by the Canadians and to install a gender equality advisory council and to have a G7 equality like that we have a G7 on economic affairs, a G7 for foreign affairs, a G7 for environment, and so on. We had a specific G7 ministerial meeting for gender equality, and we announced a number of initiatives and so on. And since then, we have done that. Every time we have the opportunity, we have, a public opportunities to speak, or we can hold the pen for a resolution, we should integrate the gender issue. And then, of course, I cannot finish this introduction without telling you about the Generation Equality Forum, which is the Beijing Plus 25 conference. And I was not there in Beijing in 1995, but I think Melanne was there, maybe Margot also. The idea is that 25 years after the Beijing conference, which was really the seminal world conference which really put in place the international normative framework for women's rights and also put in place a specific agenda, the Beijing Platform for Action, for countries to adopt and to be accountable to. We need to have another international conference on women's rights. But what we decided to do with UN Women, together with Mexico, the co-host of this forum, is that we would do things a bit differently because also the world's landscape has changed. And so instead of having, the official delegations in one building and then the 30,000 women's activists coming from all over the world in a different building and those two dialoguing with each other, we decided that we're going to integrate civil society and feminist movements from the onset of this conference. So when we started the work 2 years ago, we integrated civil society organizations, youth organizations, feminist movements, women's rights defenders in the very governance in decision-making process of this conference. And what we're going to announce in Paris in June, very happy that the president has just announced the dates for the Generation Equality Forum, which is going to take place from June 30th to July 2nd in Paris, mostly virtually, is that we're going to have action coalitions. In each coalition, we have, of course, member states, the UN, international organizations. We also have civil society. We have the private sector, because the private sector has an important role to play. We have philanthropic foundations, we have youth organizations, we have trade unions, we have many kinds of civil society organizations, because we need all these different stakeholders in order to promote and push for the gender equality agenda. So what we're going to be announcing at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris in June is a roadmap for action for the next 5 years, concrete goals that we want to collectively pursue and achieve within the next 5 years in the run-up to Agenda 2030 with the SDGs, together between member states, international organizations, civil society, private sector, and every kind of stakeholder who is interested in pushing for gender equality. And those who have volunteered for these roadmaps for action will be held accountable through UN Women and the UN system. So we do hope that it's going to impulse concrete change in the follow-up to what had been initiated by Ambassador Verveer and then by Sweden with Margot Wallström. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Delphine. Thank you so much for our 3 guest speakers. Now we can, I think, start with questions. We have many questions from students, but also from scholars. I'm very glad to see as first question, a question coming from not from a young student, but from a young scholar, Staffan de Mistura, our fantastic diplomat from the UN, who is one of our faculty. Question, what are women's chances to play a political role in Afghanistan? And that can be maybe interesting for Margot or for Melanne. I'd like to also have the question from Laura. That is a very interesting question. How are women's rights being affected amidst the pandemic, and how should governments respond to the consequent systemic violations? That can be maybe question, Delphine. You can have this question too. I have another, I think, very interesting question is from Michelle, and I'll ask again you 3 to answer this question. The question is, I would like to ask what can be done if women have tokenistic positions in parliament or are relegated to soft positions of power in the government? That is, I think, a very good question. There's a question also for me. It's a very good question, and I will try to work and to improve, because the question is a critic. Too many professors in an unbalanced gender professor and scholar faculty in PSIA. You're right. We are trying to improve, and we improved very much in our events. We had the Youth and Leaders Summit this year with 50% of speakers, and we are very happy that for the first time we had such a gender balance. But I'm sure that we will improve, and you're right, Martha, we are guilty. So why don't we start with the different questions? Margot, why don't you start?
Thank you very much. And I have to admit that I am in no way objective when it comes to answering a question from Staffan de Mistura, because he's a friend of mine. I have the highest respect for the hard work and difficult work that Staffan de Mistura has done as a special envoy for Syria, and for also being so engaged in the matter of women in Afghanistan. We have even written some articles together and tried to push for a role for women in Afghanistan. We fear very much, I think we share this concern about the role of women in the negotiations and in the game that is being played at the moment. Because we admire the Afghan women so much, the way they have taken their places in the Afghan society, the way they have educated themselves, the roles that they play in every sector in society. And where are they now in the negotiations about the future of their country, and what will happen if the Talibans gain more power, and what happens to their rights? I'm looking forward also to hearing how Melanne looks at this now, because of course the role of the US is extremely important, but this is something and a concern and an engagement that we share. And Staffan has been a true, I wouldn't say fighter, because maybe that's not the right word, but he has been working so hard and has achieved a lot. But I think, and this has followed him throughout his assignments, also both for Syria and for everything he has been doing for Afghanistan, to care about the role of women.
Thank you. Melanne?
Well, let me follow up where Margot left off. I too belong to the Staffan de Mistura fan club because he has been an extraordinary ally on these issues. And I have to say that male leadership, because it is still dominant, matters greatly when you have men in positions like he has held with respect to the UN as envoy in Afghanistan, as envoy in Syria. The role that people like he play on these issues is absolutely essential and extremely validating. So I want to thank him publicly for all that he has done, for all the reasons Margot has just stated as well. Both with respect to Afghanistan, this is an absolute moment of urgency. The women over the last 20 years, from where they were when the Taliban last ruled officially, mounted to power, not a government, but doing horrible things, particularly targeting women in ways that were unimaginable, but they were real. And we saw them depriving girls the right to go to school, pushing women out of their professions, pushing them out of the formal workplace, basically putting them in the most inhumane, marginalized positions imaginable. And over the last 20 years, you've seen dramatic changes. Afghanistan today is a young country. 60% of the population is under the age of 20. It is a country where women are in universities, girls have been educated by the tens of thousands. Women are in civil service positions, running think tanks. It's a different place, and yet the violence is going on unabated. And today that violence is targeting in a very extraordinary way women, particularly women in leadership and in civil society leadership. And the assassinations have been absolutely horrific. And in fact, 2 days ago at the State Department, when we were doing our International Women of Courage, 7 Afghan women posthumously were honored: journalists, human rights activists, Supreme Court judges, because they had been gunned down. So you have the violence and you have the progress that women have made. And the great fear is that that progress is going to be erased in whatever comes next. The peace talks in Doha have been halting at best, but as one of the female negotiators, and there are 4, said to me, we cannot let these talks die because so much rests on them in many ways. But there are a lot of forces affecting all of this. Stefan is also involved, as am I, in an effort to ensure that the education of girls, the education of women in universities continues, and that our governments and all of our governments have been involved in Afghanistan, inject that investment and commitment because it is fundamental. And we all know what education represents. And then there is the issue of the Taliban stating that they want to create an Islamic Emirates, not an Islamic Republic as currently exists under a constitution in which women's rights, all citizens' rights, minority rights are protected. But they have an extreme radical interpretation of Islam that we saw manifested back in the late 90s and in 2000 and 2001. Today, in many places where they control the territory, girls have been pushed out of school. And it, in some ways, could portend what could happen next. And so understanding that in the predominantly Muslim world, the reconciliation of women's rights and Islam goes hand in hand. Their interpretation is much more radical and extreme. So as I said, there is a lot at stake. And this is one of those issues that we've been talking about, where you have to integrate these interests into the overall interests of what is happening diplomatically, what is happening in terms of military engagement, what is happening multilaterally among our countries, because we've all been involved in Afghanistan. In fact, I can remember coming to Paris years ago for a training with a French group. And in fact, Tina Robiel is one of your great professors at Sciences Po, who's been deeply involved in these issues. So this is a moment, and I just urge everyone who's listening to pressure our own governments, but also engage in all of the ways we can. And I thank Stefan for the question and for all he's done.
Thank you. Delphine, you have the 2 questions. I would like just to underline the 2 questions. The question from it was on the topic that is, I think, very important about the pandemic. Laura, I think you remember. And the other question was about, I think it's a very important question from Michelle about what can be done when women have just tokenistic positions. How can we improve and change?
So the impact of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic on women and its aggravated effect on gender inequalities are beginning to be chronicled. So we have the first numbers, they're coming out of the UN. I'm going to cite a few out of many, but it is estimated that supplementary 47 million women will fall into the poverty across the world. UNESCO has announced that 11 million girls are at risk of never returning to school because in many countries, when the schools closed because of confinement, then the young girls had to stay at home, and then they were forced into forced marriages, or parents just decided they would rather have them at home to do house chores rather than continue to go back to school. The impact also on sexual and reproductive health and rights has been unfortunately tremendous. A number of dispensaries and clinics in underdeveloped countries have been closed or have been entirely reoriented towards COVID-19 patients. And so the provision of sexual and reproductive services and contraceptive services has been entirely interrupted, not to mention a certain number of member states and governments that have used the pretense of COVID-19 to redirect funds from sexual and reproductive health services to other services. And so the impact is well known. And what's interesting with this crisis, and very unfortunate, is that it's a different kind of crisis that we knew, for instance, with the 2008 financial crisis, which did not include confinements and lockdowns, and which also hit economic sectors that were majority of men, finance sectors, banking sectors, automobile sectors, those were majority of men. But with this crisis, not only did women suffer because of confinement, the spike in gender-based violence and domestic violence, many women had to leave the job market because one of the parents had to actually take care of the children who were staying at home. And surprise, surprise, it's always the woman who leaves her job because most of the time she earns a lowered wage than her husband, or she's in part-time job, whereas her husband is in a full-time job. But also the economic sectors that were very much hit by the crisis, hostels, catering, tourism, service industry, those are majority female industries. And so we're looking at numbers coming from the US, which are very interesting, but appalling, that the vast majority, maybe 80% of job losses in the past 6 months in the US were female jobs, were jobs held by women, because those were either economic sectors impacted by the crisis, or because the women had to leave the job market because they had to take care of the children, or they were dismissed in the first place. So the economic impacts, the social impacts, the mental health impacts is extremely grave. And this is all the more reason to have a conference such as the Generation Equality Forum. We had planned for this conference before the pandemic. We had to postpone by 1 year. And some people were asking us, but is it the priority now to look at gender equality? That we have pandemic, we need to focus and obsess about vaccines and health. Yes, this is much a priority because women were so severely impacted. And the gains that we made over the past 25 years in terms of promoting women's rights and gender equality, many gains are being reversed because of the crisis. And your second question is, are women token? Before being an ambassador, I was a member of parliament. I was elected to parliament, and I actually also worked in Afghanistan before. And I remember, so there's a 30% quota of women in the Afghan parliament. And I've been often asked the question, are there token or just wives or sisters or daughters of famous Afghan politicians? It may be so, but all studies have always shown that as soon as you reach a 25 to 30% threshold of a minority group in a majority group, then this minority group is actually able to really raise their voice and advance their interest. If you're below 25, below 30%, it still remains such a small minority that they cannot advance. They're being overwhelmed by the majority. And when I was elected in the French Parliament in 2017, overnight, we became women 30% to 40% in the French National Assembly. I can tell you this is not token. This has definitely changed the landscape. I know it's also true in the US Senate. It's also true in Sweden. I think there's about the same number of parliamentarians. When you have 40, 50% of women ambassadors, Margot can tell you, and I can tell you, this radically changes the way that women's voices are being heard, and women's issues, also gender equality, are being taken into consideration.
Thank you, Delphine.
Something?
Yes, of course, Margot.
Yeah. Thank you very much, because I really think that we should follow the advice from Kristalina Georgieva from IMF, because she says to governments and leaders all over the world that you have to invest in people, you have to provide access to finance, you have to put more money in the hands of women and find ways to do so, and also reform the tax system. So maybe that is a lesson also for the future and a way to build back better. And I think in order to avoid to have a kind of tokenism or talk about token women, I advocate for quotas. I really think that this is necessary in some places, because that is a way to break a system of discrimination, pure discrimination against women. And that is also a way to make sure that you have enough women to break any feeling of being subordinate or of a lesser value.
Can I follow up as well, Dean Letta?
Yes, of course.
On this point, I think it's a critically important point, because as Delphine said, once you're at that 25-30% threshold, that's considered a critical mass until we can get to parity. One woman alone on a board or a couple of women in a parliament, they can't really move mountains, let alone hills. So this greater participatory possibility is really important. And I look at what happened years ago based on a quota in India for the panchayats, that lowest level of representative government. And many were against it, and they said, oh, the wives will get the positions, the men will still rule behind the throne. And what all of the data shows is that women have invested money differently in sanitation, in education, in what is transforming the communities, even illiterate women in these positions. And it's been called the silent revolution in democracy in India, because not only are women being elected to quota seats, they have far exceeded quota seats. Why? Because they demonstrated competency, and they demonstrated that they're in it to help the people who elected them. And so the more examples we have, the more models of this kind of leadership. And I think that Margot's example from Kristalina Georgieva, who is, Christine Lagarde was the first IMF head who was a female, now followed by Kristalina. And both of them have really brought women's economic participation into their portfolio, where prior to that, it hardly existed. They have embarked on a lot of research. When you hear Kristalina talk today, as Margot just exemplified, she focused on COVID recovery that's also focused on women. And you're right, whoever gave us the question, that too often women are put in the lesser positions in governments. Not that those aren't important positions, but I've had many leaders say to me, you don't need to talk to me, we have a minister for women. Well, that's not where these issues need 100% to be lodged. And many of those ministries of women aren't even resourced. So this is about integration. That's what this conversation is about today, at all levels: participation, resources, and rights, as the Swedish feminist foreign policy has laid out.
Thank you. We have many other questions. I'll try to read some of them. There are two very sensitive and interesting questions. One is for Melanne. The question is from Anais, PSIA student in the Master in Human Rights. I read the question. Melanne, is for you. Do you think that feminist goals are better pursued and achieved when not framed as explicitly feminist? Put otherwise, do you think that a policy objective framed solely as feminist is less likely to catch the attention of decision makers, in particular in the US? And I Okay, I'll ask you to answer immediately this very interesting question from Anais.
Well, it is a really good question, and it is a question I frequently get. And it's why I said early on that we have a foreign policy that integrates gender, but we don't call it a feminist foreign policy. And much of that is because in the United States, in some quarters, the word feminist is still a loaded word, and the opposition will take it and blow it up. But our goal is that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. Obviously, anybody who believes in feminism knows it's about equality. But so we don't call it that, but it doesn't mean that we don't try to get to the same place. And the questioner is really right on in terms of the approach, because most decision makers today are still male. They frankly don't understand the importance of these issues. They don't understand what it has to do with their jobs. And when you have an integrative model, it's not just for the female leader, it's for the men as well, because progress for women is progress for everybody. And they will be much more effective, whether they are the secretaries for human rights or functioning on regional issues or on economic issues. They will be much more effective in reaching the outcomes that are their goals. And so that's why we came up with the phrase, it's not just the right thing to do. Fundamentally, this is the right thing to do. It's a core moral value, women's rights, absolutely fundamental. But we added, and the smart thing to do. And the smart thing was to appeal to all of those people who aren't motivated by the right thing to do. They are motivated by their own self-interest in doing their own jobs. And how does it do what Delphine said in her opening statement? This makes trade policy that much better. It makes other economic considerations that much more effective. It improves all kinds of smart policies because you have injected this gender lens. So I would rather not focus on the word. I would much rather focus on practical results and the perfect not being the enemy of the good. I really want us to make more progress. And that's what we're focused on.
Thank you, Melanne. A question from Aksaya. It's another very interesting and very sensitive question. I would like to ask Margot to answer. The question is from Aksaya, who is student in the Master in International Security. Historically, women empowerment has been used, this is what Aksaya says, as an excuse by Western countries to further colonial agenda in third world countries, legitimize their interference, in addition to which the notion of international aid by Western countries is itself questioned because of its paternalistic undertones. How can we be cognizant of and engage with this concept while applying a feminist foreign policy to developing nations? And I have a second question from Rebecca, and I'll ask Delphine to answer, or both, of course, of you, Delphine and Margot. The question from Rebecca is, how well can a country adopt a feminist foreign policy when they have serious gender inequality at home? I think is another interesting question. So, Margot, you can answer both if you wish.
There is so much to say about the development policy and how that has evolved over time, and also how different it is from one country to another, and of course a kind of a colonialism and all the downsides of this over time. I think, and I'm not an expert in the field, I can see that this has also changed a lot in recent years, and more of support to democracy, for example, and but since I would say decades back, guided by an understanding of the role of women in most communities that are poor and also need assistance, humanitarian and development assistance. And I think when that is designed in the right way, that's a good thing. And then, of course, there has to be a policy which involves people and women, so that they feel they have a say in designing these policies, and that I think is it's a good and useful debate to have about development policies. And I see, for example, in my own country that democracy and support to democracy projects is part of development policy, increasingly so. Well, to this debate about the concept, and I knew when pronouncing that we would pursue a feminist foreign policy that this would be controversial, and we still chose to call it a feminist foreign policy, because I think sometimes you need to stick your neck out, or you have to take a step like that, because it gives you a chance also to define what feminism is, to explain what feminism is. And I often say, well, look it up. What does it say? You will find that it is a policy, an ideology and a policy that aims at giving women and men the same rights, opportunities, and obligations in society. And then I knew that we had to immediately turn it into a practical policy. And in the end, it's the results that matter. To me, it has always been a thing about turning it into very concrete measures through our diplomatic representation around the world. And why it belonged to foreign policy was, of course, because I know that you cannot gain sustainable peace if women are excluded. So to me, it makes sense. It is smart policy, exactly like Melanne said. And I think that's my sixth argument, that it is smart. It's the smart and reasonable thing to do. But I knew that with it would come a curiosity, and I think also, luckily, followers in the end that did not fear this. But when you do that, if you choose a controversial concept like that and a controversial word like that, you create expectations. And that was my aim, to create also, to set an agenda and to create expectations. And then people would start to ask things from you. So are you consistent with you have to make sure that you can be consistent with domestic policies. You have to be consistent in every part of your foreign policy or defense policy. Everything is brought into the debate, and you have to be prepared for that. But that was the idea as well to begin with. But I realized that to explain this to the diplomatic staff, to all our ambassadors, I needed to present those parameters and the things that I wanted us to focus on. And you need a structure. If you have leadership, if you have a plan, if you have a goal, then you have to have a structure as well, and put that quickly in place with an ambassador, with yearly action plans, with training, all of that. That would help all our representatives around the world, and then to deliver, for example, the network of women mediators and negotiators. So that's the way forward. But I think it's fine if countries call it whatever they like, if they call it gender equality and what have you. I think that's absolutely fine. It's really what we do that matter, and to change things on the ground. Sorry for a long answer, but...
It was very interesting, Delphine.
I would like to answer the question about from PSIA also about post-colonialism. So I think you can do both things. You can recognize from a historical perspective that European colonial powers have used the pretense of women's liberation and women's freedom and gender equality to justify their policies and implementation of their policies in colonies. That's true in the 19th century, early 20th century, also very much after the Second World War. There was even a controversy, if you remember, about Afghanistan, when the US decided to intervene in Afghanistan after 9/11, backed by an international coalition. It was a division among feminists. Some of them said, well, it's good for Afghan women. We're going to, liberate Afghan women from the Taliban. But others say, well, it's again the white savior complex of the Europeans or the West coming to liberate Muslim women. So it's still a controversial issue. But you can recognize this is a historical fact, and at the same time, does not take anything away from the universality of women's rights and gender equality, saying that women's rights are human rights, as somebody very famous said in 1995, and human rights are women's rights, and those are universal rights. And the way you do that today in 2021 is that there are many, many, many local grassroots movements, feminist movements, women's rights movements in India and in the African continent, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, in South America, who have been fighting for these same rights for decades and decades and decades. And it does not take away anything from them. And also many of them use the word feminist, even though it's a much more controversial in their country that might be in Sweden or in France or in the US. But the way you do that, you avoid the top-down Western development policy is that you work with them, you raise their voices, you actually support them from the back seats, and you do what we do today with funding local grassroots organizations and deciding together with them what are going to be the criteria for funding. It's not just imposed from top down, what are the criteria? That's what Canada does with its Equality Fund. It's what we do in France. And what we do in the Generation Equality Forum, 95% of the NGOs who are in the governance are from the Global South. They are not from the Global North. You have France and Mexico. Mexico has also adopted the feminist foreign policy. And we have, again, vast majority of our stakeholders are from the Global South, and they claim the same thing as us. Women have the same right as men, and women's rights are universal rights.
Thank you, Delphine.
Can I just add one quick thing to Delphine, because she's absolutely right. And, it's often officials in our own governments who will say, you're trying to change them. That's not where we need to be going policy-wise. But the reality is, any of us going into these countries would not say, we're here to liberate the women. We would all sit down with the women and say, what do you want? We want to support you. And what I'm told in places that never heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, I don't want to be abused. I know that I shouldn't be abused as a human being. I want to be able to have a small business so I can take care of myself and my family. They want these opportunities. They want what is accorded to them as human beings. They may not be able to discuss it in the loftiest terms, but at a core, that's what we want. And the best thing we can do is support them at the grassroots level and beyond, so that they can have this for themselves. It's not a matter of forcing these policies and tenets on other people. And then just really quickly, there was a question we didn't answer about, should we be mirroring our foreign policy engagements and priorities in our own domestic policies? And the answer is yes. We at Georgetown took our global index and applied it to the United States. And it's often not a pretty picture. Depending where you live in the United States, some places are fabulous, other places are not, because of opportunities and rights. And so we have a lot of work to do. And that's why also at the national level, childcare has become a priority. Paid parental leave is now a priority. We have got to model that kind of behavior that others want to see for themselves globally.
Thank you. We have 1-2 more minutes. I would like to ask Margot to answer this question that is, I think, a very interesting one, the question from Viola. All issues are related to gender, but how can the link between gender and the environment be made more obvious so that they are addressed together in policies? Margot, do you have a final take on this point, gender and environment?
I think this is correct, and very often women are the ones who are very close to nature as well and dependent on nature, everything from collecting firewood to carrying water to putting produce or vegetables to the market and what have you. The first ones to see also and trace changes in the climate and the environment. But also we have a special thing that I know from myself, because I worry a lot about chemicals and the fact we have so many chemicals in our environment and actually in our blood. And when I was Environment Commissioner in the European Union, I took a blood test just to check on whether this was really true, that we had so many man-made chemicals that was not there in our grandparents' blood. And this turned out to be true also for me, including DDT in my blood. And that was prohibited decades ago in my country. And of course, I have then passed it on by breastfeeding my children. And I think when you understand those things and those links and effects on the human body, and especially on women more vulnerable to some of these things, you understand that there is a huge responsibility on us to take care of the environmental challenges we have, and also with biodiversity and all of the massive problems that we see at the moment. So I think we have, and I know that women have been active in environmental movements and organizations also over time. So I hope that will continue, and maybe a reborn environmental movement. So for the future. Good question.
Thank you very much, Margot. I would like to thank Margot Wallström, Melanne Verveer, Delphine O. I think it was a fantastic panel, very good questions, very sensitive topics. Congratulations to our students as usual, and thank you for all the answers. I would like to underline that at 7 o'clock Paris 9, Delphine O will be again on stage with the Junior Diplomat Initiative of Sciences Po. And so thank you for the double engagement, Delphine O, and thank you for your commitment among our faculty. Thank you very much, Margot. Thank you, Melanne. Thank you, Delphine. Thank you all. I would like to remind you all that next Wednesday meeting will be March 24th. The topic will be strategic autonomy of the European Union. That is another interesting topic. I'm sure that Margot will be more than interested in this topic, and we will have Zaki Laidi as a guest speaker. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
À bientôt. Bye.